everybody, and thank you for coming. Tonight we have David McCartney from the University of Iowa with us to talk about the protests in the 60s and 70s. His presentation is titled Uptight and Laid Back, Iowa City in the 60s. And also a reminder to please silence your cell phones if you haven't already. And please join me in welcoming David.
Thank you very much, Lindsay. Can everybody hear me? Okay. Excellent. Well, I hope the battery lasts longer than I do on the amplification tonight. I'm so glad to see all of you here, and thank you all very much for coming here. When I was in the 7th grade, which would have been in the 1968-69 school year, I had a really remarkable art teacher. His name was Mr. Heineman. I never did get his first name, but in 7th grade you addressed everybody by Mr. So-and-so or Miss So-and-so. And in our little town, I grew up in Charles City, which is about 2 hours north of here. It was pretty amazing to have an art teacher who actually showed us how to tie-dye shirts. And we did that for a class project one week. And I had that shirt for the longest time. I asked Dad if he had a short sleeve white shirt somewhere that he wanted, no longer wanted to keep. Could he part with it? And so he gave that one to me for the cause. And I had not a very imaginative approach to it. I wasn't a particularly good student in art class, but Mr. Heineman brought out things in us that we didn't even know existed. And this tie-dye shirt, by gum, it was really the best thing I ever could have witnessed at that point, at age 12. I owned that shirt for a long time. I don't know whatever happened to it. If I still had it, I would wear it tonight. But tonight, you'll have to settle for this t-shirt I got at an SAA conference about 2 years ago. SAA is the Society of American Archivists. That's our national organization. And peace, love, and archives is going to be our theme, or at least in part. So thank you all very much for joining me tonight. And for the next few minutes, I'm going to give you a very biased, admittedly, or partial review of some selected events from what was a very tumultuous decade here in Iowa City and, of course, in college and university communities throughout the country during that time. We are certainly, let me see if I can get this advance to work here. My screen seems to have frozen. Let me see what to do here. Hang on just a moment. There we go. It helps to have the correct tab up, but I regret that I did not do that before, but now I do. As Lindsay noted, tonight's program is called Uptight and Laid Back, Iowa City in the 60s. That also happens to be the name of an online exhibit that the University Library's website hosts. And it's easy to find if you go to the University Archives, which is linked off of the homepage through the Department of Special Collections. You'll find a link to that exhibit right on our front page. Another way to find it will be to Google simply the term Uptight and Laid Back, Iowa City in the 60s. And the definition of the 60s as a decade can be quite arbitrary. We know that history is fluid. There are events that occur that really don't fall neatly into time periods. But when we refer to the 60s, we really are referring to a period of time that I think in many respects culminated the actions of an earlier time. It was a buildup, if you will. And one example of that is what historians like to refer to as the long civil rights movement. And by long, we mean really the civil rights movement could be defined as beginning in 1619 in the United States. There have been all forms of protest, all forms of resistance to racism, to slavery, to other forms of institutionalized discrimination. But so much activity came to a head in the 1960s as the result of direct action that occurred in the years leading up to that decade. So I'm going to begin with 1959. In 1959, the School of Religion at the University of Iowa took it upon itself to extend an invitation to a young Baptist minister from Alabama who had just a few years before led a successful boycott of the Montgomery City bus system. And of course, I'm referring to the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King, Jr. This photograph appears in the 1960 Hawkeye Yearbook, and he was hosted by the School of Religion. In this photograph, Professor Robert Michelson at far left was at the time director of the school, which today is known as the Department of Religious Studies within the College of Liberal Arts and Sciences. This event was absolutely memorable to those who attended. There was a full house in the Iowa Memorial Union on the night of November, I want to say it's 17th, I'm not sure of the exact date, but it was in November of 1959. And Dr. King spoke to a full house in the main lounge of the IMU. His speech was tape recorded by the university that evening, and we have that tape recording available online through the online exhibit. You'll find that when you scroll down further on the main page of the exhibit. When Dr. King spoke here, his appearance began, if the letters to the editor in the Daily Iowan at the time are any gauge, they are an indication that there was a very strong awakening among white residents of Iowa City, as well as the predominantly white University of Iowa, of the status of civil rights legislation in the United States. And so it gave rise to, well, here we go again. Let me see if I can, here we go. It gave rise to responses from students in a number of different ways, one of which was the organization of a group called the Student Association on Racial Equality. This was a local chapter of what later became known as the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, or SNCC as it was referred to. One of the founders of SNCC nationally was the Honorable John Lewis, for many years a representative in the U.S. Congress from a district in Georgia. SNCC nationally had a great deal of visibility and influence, but locally, chapters such as SARE, which was organized here at the University of Iowa in, we believe, as early as 1961, began to have an impact as well in terms of promoting a greater awareness or understanding of the need for human rights legislation, both at the local and national level. So this particular item appeared in the Daily Iowan. It's a fundraising note that was published on March 21st, 1963. And so this was probably about 2 years or so after the initial SARE meetings. And by this time, the organization had gained enough momentum in order to attract crowds to venues like McBride Auditorium, the Czech and Slovak Hall on the north side neighborhood was a venue for fundraising music events to raise money for organizations that are delivering direct aid to black citizens in the Deep South during this rather challenging time. At that time, and you may recognize this gentleman, those of you who were associated with the university during that time, a much beloved dean of students at the time, and the first African-American dean in not only the University of Iowa, when president of the university, Sandy Boyd, appointed him to the position in 1967, but also the first African American dean at a Big Ten university, and I'm referring to Philip Hubbard. Dr. Hubbard was the first African American faculty member at Iowa. He joined the College of Engineering in 1947. And one of his biographical works is a book that was published probably about 10 years before his death back in 2001, New Dawns. And this particular title recounts his own experience in Iowa City in terms of how the city can move forward with human rights legislation. He, along with Sandy Boyd and others, were instrumental in organizing the Commission on Human Rights in Iowa City. And although it was nominally years in the planning, it became officially organized in 1963. And he recounts this period in his book, including anecdotes of experiences of black residents of Iowa City who had difficulty finding housing off campus. By this time, the university had eliminated the de facto practice of segregation. After World War II, African American students were at last permitted to live in on-campus housing, but the fact that that practice ended certainly by no means meant that there was an end to discrimination in Iowa City. So Dr. Hubbard and other like-minded citizens organized the early iteration of the Commission on Human Rights. And this was a movement that gained a great deal of momentum in the immediate time to follow. National events by 1965 were having a deep impact on residents in Iowa City. This is a photograph taken, and I'm sorry I don't have the credit printed on the screen, but the photographer was Mike Toner. He was a staff photographer for the Daily Iowan at the time. This is in mid to late March of 1965. During that time in the Deep South, in Alabama, what became a very violent march, not intended to be violent, of course, but violent at the hands of law enforcement officers in Alabama, the march from Selma to the state capitol in Montgomery. It was thwarted by a violent encounter with state law enforcement officers at the Edmund Pettus Bridge on what became known as Bloody Sunday. In response to that, a local student who was in, I believe, in the College of Engineering, I'm not sure if by this time he had switched majors, but a sophomore by the name of Stephen Smith, who grew up in Marion, just outside Cedar Rapids, took note of how unjust it was. The previous year, in 1964, Steve participated in Freedom Summer in Mississippi. Some of you may be familiar with that narrative. Freedom Summer was an effort by SNCC, the organization I mentioned a few minutes ago. And it was an effort to register African Americans in Mississippi to vote. Steve was one of about 800 volunteers from around the country, many of them from other colleges and universities. There were about a dozen volunteers from Iowa City who traveled to Mississippi in June of 1964 to participate. It was a very dangerous mission. You may recall there were 3 civil rights workers who were murdered by members of the Ku Klux Klan. It was clearly a statement to the remaining volunteers early on that summer that it was going to be a very, very dangerous mission. The prosecution was long overdue. I believe the maximum that any of the defendants had eventually were sentenced to came to less than 10 years of prison time. I'm not absolutely certain of that, but I do know that there was a great deal of deferred justice, and by the time justice had been brought, that many believed it was inadequate. Well, these activities, 1964, 65, even though they were happening elsewhere in the country, hundreds if not thousands of miles away, they left an impact on young people and older people as well in northern communities. So Steve, who had himself been attacked, he was assaulted on at least 2 occasions in Mississippi in the course of his work the summer before, decided to take it upon himself to lead a hunger strike in front of the Iowa City Post Office downtown. And this photograph by Mike Toner was transmitted around the country via the Associated Press, of which the Daily Iowan was and is a member. The activity that Steve initiated raised about $4,000 over an 8-day period. So in 1965 dollars, that was a pretty substantial amount of money. The community did respond, and he was quite appreciative of it, but as he said in at least one of his public statements, that there really is no replacement for physically being present for those who need the support. But he felt very strongly about this, and as did many others, of course, who supported the work of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. In terms of activism, probably the two-prong issues, hot-button issues, if you will, during that time, of course, not only included the long civil rights movement, but of course the war in Vietnam. By the end of 1965, President Lyndon Johnson committed almost 500,000 American soldiers to the effort in Southeast Asia. This was a very controversial prosecution of the war in many circles, but for the most part, Middle America, whatever that might be defined as, accepted what the Johnson administration was pursuing. And the opinions, at least up until late 1965, were by and large divided among students based on letters to the editor in the Daily Iowan. And then comes October of 1965. A few months earlier that year, Congress passed a law which essentially criminalized the act of willfully destroying one's selective service registration card, the draft card. And the law included provisions such as prison time for up to 10 years, or 5 years, excuse me, 5 years, and a civil fine of up to $10,000. This was a law intended, of course, to discourage people from burning their draft cards in protest of the war up until August of 1965, when the law was passed and signed by President Johnson. There were indeed a number of draft card burning protests around the country. But the law, as you might expect, had an immediate chilling effect. If you knew that you were going to be prosecuted, it would be best to keep your head down and not cross that line. Well, in mid-October, a protester in New York City defied that law. He burned his draft card outside an induction center, Manhattan, I believe. And then about 10 days later, on around October 20th, I don't remember the exact date, but later in October, Steve Smith appears in the news again, and this time he appears at the Soapbox Sound-Off, which was an open mic platform in the Iowa Memorial Union. Soapbox Sound-Off has a story all its own, and I won't veer too far off the narrative here, except to say that many of you may have heard of the free speech movement at UC Berkeley. We had something similar here at Iowa, and it happened in parallel at about the same time, beginning around 1964, called Soapbox Sound-Off. And the university administration thought this would be a healthy way to channel the free speech demands of students through a platform that would permit a variety of points of view in an environment that would be accessible to many. So indeed, that lower level of the IMU was where this happened every Wednesday at late morning, between 11 and 1 o'clock, every Wednesday from sometime in 1964. It lasted probably until the late 1960s at some point. But during one of these sound-offs in October of 1965, Steve Smith went up to the microphone and announced that he was indeed going to burn his draft card. Somebody apparently tipped off the media. There were at least 2 television cameras there, and of course an AP press photographer. And in terms of how his action had an impact on students, again, I'm referring to letters to the editor and the DI on campus. The volume was turned up. I really do believe this was our watershed event here in Iowa City in terms of how student activism became really a phenomenon that broke out into the open. Up to that point, protests were somewhat subdued here. They certainly occurred, but this really brought out a great deal of conflict and a lot of tension, not only across the community, but within Steve's own family. His parents very strongly objected to what he did. They had supported his civil rights work, but his father was quoted in the paper, in the papers at the time, including the Des Moines Register, that he really wished his son hadn't done that. He felt, as a World War II veteran, that this was an affront to those of his generation. So there were a lot of very painful conflicts arising from this. And there's no question that it had a lasting effect, not only, as I said, community-wide, but within many, many families. Steve was arrested 2 nights later. This is a photograph of Steve taken. I don't believe these next couple of images were ever published, and this is the first time I'm using these images tonight. This is a photograph of Steve taken probably about an hour before his arrest by the FBI on Friday night of, I believe, October 22nd, 1965. He's in an apartment upstairs. You may know the building today as St. Birch Tavern. He was in an apartment up there, staying with friends who were supportive of him, and his emotions probably, just from looking at this image, I think that he was probably having a great deal of personal grief and stress at the moment. But he later said he never regretted doing what he did. This image and the next 2 were taken by a man by the name of D. Gordon. At the time, D was representative from a field representative for SDS, Students for a Democratic Society, which had a very strong presence here in Iowa City at that time. But D was based in Chicago, and he was contacted by local SDS members and briefed on what had happened in Iowa City. It was only the second time that a draft card had been burned publicly in defiance of the federal law, and the first time that it happened on a college campus. It happened here. It did not happen in Madison. It did not happen at Columbia. It did not happen in Berkeley, but it happened here in Iowa City. And so the SDS people in Chicago took note of this, and they were a bit taken aback that such a drastic action occurred. But D was dispatched to Iowa City to not only talk with the local SDS members to counsel them on what their next steps should be as an organization, because Steve was very clear about this. He was not a member of SDS. But nonetheless, the local chapter did support him. The photographs that Dee took were, I think, later used in an SDS newsletter that did not reach very wide circulation. But this image of him, to me, I think is very, very striking, and so much can be inferred from it. You can walk by this door these days. It's just below Iowa Avenue on the west side of Dubuque Street. Again, just adjacent to St. Birch Tavern. And this is Steve it's early evening, and he's being escorted out by an FBI agent, if you can see what the image is of the other man in the doorway there. It's very, very hard to make out, but you can see it there, hopefully. Steve was taken into custody. He was held by federal authorities in Davenport. In early 1966, he was tried and convicted in U.S. District Court in Des Moines, but he was sentenced to probation because at the time of the draft card burning, he was not yet 21. The judge did exercise leniency in that regard. However, there were a number of personal challenges that he faced in the years ahead. He was unable to find employment. He eventually returned to the family shoe repair business in Marion. Eventually found his way as a computer science instructor at Kirkwood Community College. I never met Steve. He died a number of years ago, but I have met a number of people who did know him, including his widow, his two children, his one surviving brother, a number of other people, a mentor of his from the history faculty here, and all of whom I've been able to interview for our oral history collection. So for those who are interested, they may certainly, you may certainly pursue that research further in the university archives. So Steve's action elicited responses statewide, because it was a state news story covered heavily by the Des Moines Register. And right here on campus, this is on the Pentecrest. Again, this photo was taken by Mr. Gordon. I wish I had more information about this, about the context, except that it was probably 1 or 2 days after the draft card burning incident at the IMU. I look at this image and I'm just very troubled by the image of the white young man to the left, seemingly mocking the young African-American, presumably student, holding up her sign in support of Steve's action. And of course the counter-protesters who surround her, who believe that the American policy in Vietnam and later Southeast Asia as a whole is to be defended. Disturbances intensified. Again, on our website, we have a link to a motion picture film that was a documentary produced by a couple of members of the Department of English faculty in 1968 or so. This is based on an incident in December of 1967. Outside the IMU, it was during the first week of December. Classes were beginning to wind down in anticipation of winter break, but there were still, I think, 10 days or 2 weeks of classes remaining for that part of the fall term. Students would still return after holiday break to complete the fall semester in those days. But there was a very, very strong reaction against the presence of recruiters from Dow Chemical Company who came to our campus. They visited the University of Wisconsin at Madison, a number of other Midwestern universities to recruit seniors in the College of Engineering who were preparing to graduate and looking for careers perhaps in chemical engineering. Dow Chemical was a major defense industry contractor with the Department of Defense, and they manufactured what's the name of the defoliant that was used, but also they manufactured napalm. And it came to light, I'm sorry, Agent Orange later, I think. I'm not sure about the timeline of that particular product, but napalm was really at the heart of this demonstration. There was even a plastic doll meant to represent a baby that was burned. Just life ended, such a young life ended by American forces. And so, excuse me a minute. The protest drew probably between 200 and 300 people just outside the IMU around the intersection of Madison and Market Streets. The parking garage across the street from the IMU had just been completed about a year before, and it provided a very convenient observation deck for a number of spectators who happened by to see what all the commotion was about. And you'll see those images in the motion picture film I mentioned. The documentary is called On a Confrontation in Iowa City. And if you go to the website for the 60s, you'll find a link to that a little bit further down the screen. There was a great deal of reaction, of course, against the protest because it did turn violent. However, there were witnesses who stated it became violent because of provocation by the Iowa State Highway Patrol and also the Johnson County Sheriff's Office and other law enforcement officers. And there is evidence that the violence was provoked by authorities, as well as to some extent those who initiated the protest itself. They were provoking, but not necessarily in a violent way, but they were barricading entrances and exits at the IMU in order to disrupt the interviewing that was scheduled to take place that morning. Protests continued unabated for the next 2 to 3 years particularly. This is a flyer that was, I love the artwork of this. And the map showing the route of this particular march for the Vietnam moratorium held locally October 15th, 1969. It was about a month before the national moratorium held in Washington, D.C. And the march route shows a very familiar path that many protests have taken in Iowa City over the years, from College Green, incorrectly identified here as College Park, and following about 6 blocks east toward the Pentacrest at Iowa Avenue and Clinton Street. The protests became particularly violent in the spring of 1970. The shootings at Kent State on May 4th, 1970, provoked a very strong reaction locally. There is, to this day, controversy over how the Old Armory temporary building burned down. The university, at least at the time, maintained that it was due to faulty wiring. However, there are indeed some credible witnesses to this day who have said that they believed there were people who had entered and quickly exited the building before it burned down. Old Armory Temporary was also known as Big Pink. It housed the Department of Rhetoric. Why that building, if indeed it had been targeted, I'm not quite sure why rhetoric would have been targeted, but ROTC was targeted across the river during this time. There were certainly threats directed against the leadership training program, and there was certainly a great deal of uncertainty as to whether a program like ROTC would even continue. But it not only continued, but it continued to flourish in its own way. The FBI, as you might suspect, had a network of informants on campus, and they compiled reports on specific individuals. And around 1985, my predecessor, Earl Rogers, secured copies of records that the FBI had compiled. These were actually obtained initially by the Des Moines Register under the Freedom of Information Act. and Earl, I believe, contacted the Register to ask if they could provide photocopies to the university archives. And so we have them. They're, as you might expect, they're heavily redacted. However, they do give a good indication of the presence of intelligence gathering activity, both here, not only here, but also at Iowa State University and other campuses around the state. So we have the University of Iowa related FBI records from that period. I've not looked at them closely, but I would invite you to, now that we're open again for service, and I'll have more information about that in a few minutes. I mentioned ROTC and the fact that it remained viable, it remained active through some very challenging times. And these images, images that we have online in our exhibit include a scrapbook from Company B2, I believe, if I have the terminology correct. This is the Army ROTC, Company B2, some type of a recognition event that was held in 1969 at the height of much of the protest. And as I said, there were certainly calls to shut down ROTC on campus. President Boyd opposed that. He ensured that those who chose to participate in ROTC would be able to exercise that right. And I think this is a testament to the nature of President Boyd's leadership during that time. He was very adamant that classes not be disrupted, that truly in the tradition of free inquiry, that the university continue to function, ideally without interruption. There were challenges that spring, but it became clear that the administration was going to hold firm to the notion of operating with the option of classes for students to continue to attend if they so chose. But in early May of 1970, not long after the Kent State shootings and later Jackson State, the university administration sent a notice out to parents and really anybody associated with the university that the administration made the decision that if students chose to end their semester at that time, they could do so, and they would have the option to return to their homes about 3 weeks early. I'm not sure what the actual amount of time remained, but probably up to a month early prior to graduation. But those who would prefer to continue with their classes may certainly do so as well. And so with that, the university did not technically ever shut down, although there was some attrition of students. I believe, and I don't have the source with me, but I believe about a third of the students chose to leave early with the grades that they already had. But through it all, ROTC continued to function and resisted calls to be shut down. I would like to take a moment to recognize individuals who were associated with the University of Iowa who during this time lost their lives in Vietnam, Laos, Cambodia between 1962 and 1975. In fact, a few of these were killed while on duty in the 1950s. Although the Korean conflict was underway at that time, there were indeed a couple of casualties in Southeast Asia during that time, during the French occupation of Indochina. These names are listed in the Iowa Memorial Union. The Memorial Wall of Honor is located in the main lobby area along the, it would be the north wall, not far from the main lounge. And names of all individuals are listed there, and also in an online memorial that we at the archives had assisted the IMU in developing several years ago. And if I may, I'll leave this for us to reflect upon for a moment. I mentioned Sandy Boyd. Willard Boyd, we all know as Sandy, was president of the university from 1969 until 1981. And he succeeded Howard Bowen, who was much embattled at that time. Dr. Bowen accepted a position at the Claremont colleges in California. And Sandy succeeded Howard Bowen at a time when there was great tension on campus. In fact, there never really was a formal inauguration ceremony for Dr. Boyd, and it's quite clear that he's overdue for one. So I hope we can still schedule one for him. But in his book, and I don't know if any of you have had an opportunity to read this yet, but Sandy wrote a delightful and absolutely informative memoir entitled A Life on the Middle West's Never-Ending Frontier. It's published by the University of Iowa Press, and he devotes some discussion to this period as one of great challenge, of course, but one of an affirmation to the academy as a place for all ideas to be permitted to be expressed. He said he was personally opposed to the war. He certainly sympathized with those who resisted the draft, but he also felt that it was his duty as an academic officer to ensure that all perspectives were represented. I'm going to shift gears a little bit and talk for a couple of minutes about other aspects of life on campus during the 1960s. In early 1968, Dean Hubbard issued a report that included reference to the need for especially recognized spaces for historically underrepresented groups on the University of Iowa campus. And as a predominantly white institution, it's quite easy for black students here to feel left out or ignored or overlooked. And in order to help foster community, in early 1968, Dr. Hubbard proposed the concept of a cultural center, not only for black students, but eventually other communities as well. And so in the fall of 1968, it did not take long for the university to respond to this memorandum and recommendation that Dr. Hubbard had put forth. The Afro-American Cultural Center, as it was called at the time, opened, I believe it was initially on Market Street toward the bottom of the hill as you approach the IMU intersection with Madison. And later, I think less than 2 years later, moved to its present day location on Melrose. It was one of the first such cultural centers in the country. And again, the University of Iowa really had set the tone for other public universities to follow in terms of establishing recognized spaces for historically marginalized groups. LNAC, the Latino Native American Cultural Center, is the second center to have appeared on campus. It opened as the Chicano Indian American House in 1970. The emerging gay rights movement in Iowa City very much happened in parallel with the activism of Stonewall of 1969 in New York and the activism that occurred before 1969. This is a 1967 issue of the Iowa Defender, which has what we believe to be the first published account chronicling the emergence of the gay rights movement in Iowa City. And this particular issue is, I believe, on microfilm at the university's main library. In 1970, the homecoming parade was almost a non-entity. The fervor that was running at the time against so many established traditions. In 1970, there were just so many that were being regarded as irrelevant or no longer of any real purpose. But the Gay Liberation Front to the rescue. They are one of a few countercultural groups, if you will, that organized a very, shall we say, informal parade which included a convertible with 4 or 5 founding members of Gay Liberation Front. I can't help but think how much bravery it would take to show your face in a public venue, even if it's as purportedly a safe community such as a university. It just strikes me as a very courageous step to take to make that public statement in such a public way. There was no homecoming queen that year, unless you count the Gay Liberation Front entry, and I don't remember their name. But this photograph appears in the 1971 Hawkeye yearbook. That fall, in 1970, the University of Iowa did become the first public university in the nation to officially recognize a gay student organization. And it happened with initial funding from the University of Iowa student government to help support public education activities. What's college without music, right? So we've got this great, amazing new band from England. They're going to be in Iowa City for a gig one night. We should go. We should go. Yeah. Hardly anybody went because nobody heard of Led Zeppelin. This is January of 1969, and their first hit didn't make it to the radio until about 6 or 8 months later. And what a missed opportunity. But those who, I don't know if anybody here went by any chance, but I would love to meet anyone who might have been there that night and let me know if they felt that this was perhaps history in the making. Often we don't recognize history in the making until long after the fact, and we might not make that note within ourselves, but perhaps with somebody who attended that night, we might have some more light shed on that experience. Well, we know that one of the other hallmarks of the 1960s was the liberalizing of student codes of conduct. And one of those barometers is the Code for Co-eds. This is one of my favorite go-to resources. The Code for Co-eds was published by the Associated Women Students for about 30 years. It started around 1937, and by 1970, again, probably the people who had been preparing it, probably the next class moving up thought, you know, its time has passed. We don't need a code for co-eds anymore. And so in lieu of that, the university's own code of student conduct became the de facto source of what you could and could not do without fear of penalty on campus. I won't go into any detail about what the Code for Co-eds contains, except that I will note that in the mid-1950s, it had a very useful grid in the center section. It was a booklet, maybe 20 pages or so, and you would open it up to the centerfold, if you will, and there was a chart. It was a grid that outlined on one axis the event, whether it was a football game or perhaps a Sunday afternoon tea at a faculty member's home, or anything else in between. And the other grid was the type of attire. So it's really not necessary to wear pumps to a football game. Saddle shoes are fine. It's a really great indicator of social mores of the time. But so many of these rules, these conventions, were challenged, of course, during the 1960s. In 1971, dormitories at Iowa's 3 public universities were given the green light to go co-ed. I remember that date because my father at the time was on the Iowa State Board of Regents, and he was in the minority on that. He opposed the idea of men cohabitating with women in the same building. It was an issue he and I disagreed on at the time. But it nonetheless happened. The Board of Regents approved it, and by that fall of 1971, I believe, Courier was, I think, one of the first dorms on campus to become co-ed. But I don't know that for certain. But in any event, changes became very apparent. Change was in the wind, and it culminated, if you will, with this news item from February 6, 1973, in the Daily Iowan. The state Senate passed a bill to extend rights to 18-year-olds in Iowa. And at the time, that included alcohol consumption to the extent that other age of majority rights could be extended at 18. That happened in Iowa. Voting, of course, was done at the federal level through an amendment to the U.S. Constitution later that same year. I'm not sure how my father voted on that, or would have voted on that. He left the Board of Regents, ran for the state Senate in 1972. He was elected to a staggered short 2-year term. He would have voted on this, and I honestly don't know how he voted. I'll have to go back to the Red Book or the Iowa Official Register and check to see how he voted on that. Well, we have a lot of resources in the university archives. These are a few examples of the collections that we have. Those strings of numbers that you see after each collection name, RG dot, 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 those are collection numbers that we use to identify the collections on the stack so that we can bring them out to you in our reading room. RG stands for record group. That's a cluster of collections that we have that share a certain common denominator. Record group 2, for example, would be student life related collections, and we have a lot of record group 2 collections that may interest you. We have records from the cultural centers, the Black Student Union, and more recently groups like the American Indian Science and Engineering Society. We are very pleased to work with organizations across the board, across the university. And you can find this same information on our website. In addition to the Archives website and the Uptight and Laid Back online exhibit, the Iowa Digital Library is a really fun source of images. If you want to poke around a bit, here are some examples of collections that I think may be of interest. We are always adding content. So if you don't find what you're looking for, contact one of us and we'll be happy to put you in touch with the right material, or hopefully we'll be able to add it to our expanding holdings. And this is the web address for our online exhibit. As I said, you can Google it just by typing in Uptight and Laid Back Iowa City, and it'll take you to our homepage. Well, I'd like to close with a quotation from Sandy Boyd, who, while he wasn't officially inaugurated in a formal ceremony, he did have, in the fall of 1969, a statement that he presented to members of the faculty. And this quotation is something I keep on the bulletin board in my office. And I think it just sums up wonderfully the temper of the times. The challenge before us is no greater than that before our academic predecessors. We should welcome the challenge and have confidence in our ability to meet it. I'll be happy to take any questions. I'd love to hear from you if you have any experiences to share. Perhaps some of you were in Iowa City in the 1960s. If you were, I'd love to hear about it. I don't know if this microphone works. I'll have to check with Lindsay to see if we can get a microphone up if anybody wants to do a pass around. Otherwise, I'll repeat your question if you just have a question that you would like to bring up. Thank you. thank you all for being here. That's my husband, and he held a flash number up that said 6. And he said, oops, and he turned it over. Thank you. Yes?
One of the things that I remember from the 60s, and I think it may be way out of the time span of this. One of the things I remember from the 60s, and it may be way out of the time span of this, is Dewey Stewart being taken down to the fairgrounds south of Iowa City. And I can't remember whether he was kept there or he insisted on being there by the National Guard. Do you remember that and what it was all about?
I don't know that incident. I remember Dewey Stewart was dean of the graduate college at the time. And he, like President Boyd and others, were adamant that the university remain open. But I've not heard about that incident, so does anybody else have any recollection of that?
Maybe somebody else can remember it. I just know he was, and I couldn't remember exactly why. It was to get him out of the way in some fashion.
Well, there was, I'm glad you mentioned that, because there was a corps of administrators called the Administrative Liaison Group, the ALG. And this was a group of an inner circle, which I'm sure included Dean Stewart. And they actually met out at Oakdale at an undisclosed location to discuss any possible actions to take in case things got out of hand. And we have some records from ALG that confirm that. So it's possible that that was a part of the ALG strategy at the time. Why the fairgrounds, I don't know. I'll do the Oprah.
I'm just wondering if you have ever heard of an organization at the University of Iowa called the Folk Music and Socialist Discussion Club. That's an organization that got organized in the mid to late 50s, and it was that group that invited Pete Seeger to come to Iowa City and perform on 2 occasions. The first time at the Czechoslovakian Hall,
Yes.
which we hardly filled, and the second time at the Iowa Memorial Union in the main lounge, where we had to turn people away. And it was the core of that group that ultimately became the Iowa City chapter of the SDS.
Interesting. I didn't know it had evolved from that. I am familiar with the Socialist Discussion Club because they met off campus in the late 1950s. Ed Methinsky was an original member, and he later became a congressman from this district. They met in a private home just south of campus, I think on South Capitol. The building is still there. One of the occupational hazards of my work is I like to retrace footsteps sometimes. And I came across a folder that we have about the Socialist Discussion Club. They met off campus because, as I understand, the university would not permit them to meet on campus. I wasn't aware of the folk music connection, but that's really neat. I knew that Pete Seeger had played at the Czechoslovak Hall, which I think is the Kusel school today.
Have you ever discussed the some violent actions that happened here at that time? You know, breaking windows and that sort of thing.
My husband was teaching at Schaefer Hall at that time, and
my husband was teaching at Schaefer Hall at that time. He was assigned to be at this certain door, so the doors were locked, and then he was not to let anyone in. And I remember him remarking at dinner that night. He wasn't exactly sure how he was going to keep SDS from coming in if they wanted to, but he went down there and he stood there and nothing happened. So
It was very mild.
Who was your husband?
Dick Wright,
Okay.
was,
Okay.
language department.
I don't know about very much detail about faculty members who were assigned double duty essentially to serve in that way, but John Harper, who many of you may know, was associated with the English department for many years, and I interviewed John about this kind of issue a couple of years ago, and he said that they were indeed assigned extracurricular tasks, either for security. In John's case, he was he shuttled papers back and forth from EPB to the county jail, where either students or even some faculty members were being held, but they still had to get graded papers in. John was ferrying these papers back and forth from campus to the pokey, and
I think Dick would have preferred to have that job.
excuse me.
They did have, all the buildings were patrolled by faculty and some staff, but they wouldn't let the women do it. Which I thought was funny because the education librarian was 5 feet 11 and considerably taller than most of the people in what was then East Hall.
Now, someone would be trifled with. Any other questions? Comments? Oh, yes.
Follow up on that, East Hall, I was a student here between 66 and 70, a music student. And my oboe professor, I was an oboist, my oboe professor was James Lakin. And he and I sat all night as vigilantes, or vigilant people in East Hall to keep it safe. And we found out a lot about each other that we didn't know that was other extra musical because I didn't really talk about stuff like that at my lessons. But I was really sickened by the war, and I was protesting in the streets. I never got my head bashed in, and I never did any time in prison.
But the computer center was in the basement of East Hall.
That's right. That's right. They told us, you got to be serious here. This building is, if anything's going to be targeted, East Hall is going to be it. So I remember staying up all night with my prof, and we shared each other's views. He was kind of very conservative, wonderful man, I loved him dearly. And we found out about each other. Another thing I remember is getting a letter in 1968 from the president of the university, Howard Bowen at that time. And I was chosen, I don't know how I was chosen, but I was one of about 20 undergraduates who came for a circular discussion in his office in the Capitol. Well, that we met in the Capitol for some reason, in his office. Anyway, I thought this was going to be about the protests. He was going to feel people out. No, we talked about parties and what was going on and this and that and the other thing. I got so mad, I just left. I just got up and left. He says, you didn't say anything. I said, this isn't my party. I just left. And one more story, if I may.
Louder.
Oh, sorry.
Mine.
Excuse me. I was going to leave campus. May 4th, 1970 was, Kent State just blew my insides out. I cried, I was mad, I was scared. He comes back, and I wanted to go home. But I couldn't talk to any of my music friends, anybody. And I was the president of the band at senior year. The students elected me as the president. But I couldn't talk to anyone about the war. No one listened to me. I had to get stuff off my chest. And it took one graduate student, who was a tuba player. He's the only one that I sat down with and talked and unloaded. But the band was asked to stay in town for the graduation ceremony, because we always played, you know, various patriotic tunes and everything else that goes with that. I didn't want to do it, but I don't know how many people know this, but I had a black armband. That was the thing in those days. If you wore a black armband, especially at your left elbow, left arm, you were a protester. You didn't want the war. So I don't even know how many of my friends noticed that. A couple of people close to me bumping my elbow. Like, what are you doing? But I didn't want to go out and say, well, I couldn't find any of you to talk to. Every time I brought it up, they said, you know, go to your practice room. Do your music. That's what you're here for. Well, technically I was, but a lot of my soul was built up in this.
You raised it, thank you very much. You raised an important point that while there was a sense of community and thrill, perhaps even being among kindred spirits out on the streets, that there were many who were not able to share their truly profound thoughts about the war at the time, for whatever reason yours among them. So thank you very much for that. Somebody else, I think, had, oh yes, Alan.
I was interested in the picture that showed the student being dragged as he was being arrested, and I kept looking, but I couldn't find me in that picture. But I was there. That was a very interesting demonstration. It started in the morning, really early, with a bunch of students sitting on the steps and then other students coming around, essentially preventing anybody from going in and having an interview with the Dow Chemical. And so, but they said, we're peaceful. If you want to go in, we won't resist you. And they didn't. But what that meant that the person to get through sort of had to swim over the top of the crowd. And they first had to take off their shoes and take their wallet out and so forth, so that somebody wouldn't take it as they did. And they would then swim over the group and get in. And some of them who did that really weren't interested. They just did it as a challenge. They really weren't interested in interviewing. But as the day wore on, some of the swimmers and wrestlers came down and were more upset, and so there was a little bit of violence here and there. And so eventually the police came with buses, and they had not only the police, but from the Coralville Reservoir, the state police, all of them. And they asked to started arresting us, and we saw the students taken in there. Well, the students had been there all day, and it was cold, and the rain had started in the afternoon, and they were out there. And to some extent, getting arrested and getting put in a nice warm bus. It was a real relief.
You could get your 3 squares in a hot, right? Like we described a couple of minutes ago, it seems like the birth of the mosh pit. I think Iowa preceded the grunge era by about 20 years. Anybody else? Well, thank you all very much for coming. I'm sorry, we have a question. Okay. Meeting adjourned, after all. Thank you again very much. Please feel free to contact me if you have questions.